One of the scariest feelings in life is realizing you built a life you're no longer fully connected with. But stop feeling afraid to leave it. You go to work, handle responsibilities, pay the bills, smile when necessary. But internally, you feel trapped between safety and purpose, comfort and growth, survival and becoming. That emotional tension can quietly drain the life out the most ambitious person if they stay there too long. Because eventually people stop asking, what do I really want? And start asking, what can I survive? But today we're going to talk about what happens when you realize life protecting your comfort may also be limiting your growth. One of the most frustrating feelings in life is when people on the outside casually tell you, just leave, just leave that job, just leave that relationship, just walk away. And honestly, sometimes those conversations frustrate me because life is rarely that simple when when you actually just do care. Because for many people, feeling trapped is not always about a weakness. Sometimes it's about a responsibility. Sometimes it's gratitude. Sometimes it's remembering seasons where you didn't have opportunities. I understand that so deeply because I remember what it felt like not being employed. I remember hearing stories from friends struggling to find work. I also remember understanding what instability actually feels like. Therefore, when you finally get an opportunity, build experience, create stability, and develop a career, you don't always want to move reckless because, again, you care. And honestly, that's where the emotional conflict begins because internally, you may feel disconnected, unfulfilled, frustrated, and most of all, mentally exhausted. But externally, you still understand the value of what you currently have because that tension can make people feel trapped emotionally. And we create these little sayings to comfort ourselves through those times. If I'm being honest, I've said them too. You know them. The grass isn't greener on the other side. They just use better fertilizers. But if you really unpack that statement, what we are actually saying, we're saying somebody found a better way to grow. That changes the entire perspective because eventually I realized the trap feeling is not always the environment itself. Sometimes it's the information we keep feeding ourselves. Most people do not fully understand certain lessons until life forces them to experience those lessons personally. We hate admitting that if we're just being honest, because if somebody warned us about something, most of us will eternally think that's your experience. I'm different until it happens to us. And then suddenly we understand emotionally. I learned that lesson deeply in project management. I remember a project team warning me about a stakeholder before implementation started. They told me during this project, this stakeholder is going to create requests that have nothing to do with the actual project. And internally, I remember thinking, I need to see this through for myself. Sure enough, implementation starts, and suddenly the stakeholder begins creating all of these unrelated requests, completely disconnected from the actual project scope. And in the moment, I realized something important. Experiences teaches lessons differently than warnings ever could. That's also why I've learned to be careful with labels people place on each other. I remember one time a project team member told me, "You're defensive." Now, most people immediately become emotionally uh, disconnected after they hear that. But instead of reacting emotionally, I asked, can you explain how I'm being this just defensive? They responded, well, you don't take feedback. So I asked another question. How would you recommend I take feedback? And their answer was, you should just listen. But see, here's the problem. If you fully don't understand why decisions were made, what pressure existed, what context existed, and what constraints existed, then are we actually communicating effectively? Or are we simply assigning labels to incomplete understanding? That changed how I viewed leadership, feedback, and even feeling trapped myself. Because eventually I realized many people are not trapped physically first, they are trapped mentally through fear, assumptions, labels, past experience, eternal opinions, and incomplete understanding. Sometimes, and I do mean sometimes, the breakthrough starts the moment you stop blindly accepting every narrative people hand to you and finally start thinking deeply for yourself. Because maybe the real danger is not only staying trapped, maybe the real danger is accepting a version of life, leadership, identity that no longer aligns with who you know you are becoming internally. Principle number one, feeling trapped often starts mentally before it starts physically. One of the biggest realizations I had in life is that many people are not trapped only by environments. They are trapped by the narratives they repeat to themselves consistently. And honestly, those narratives can sound responsible, logical, and even mature on the surface. The grass isn't greener on the other side. Just be grateful. Maybe this is just how life is. At least I have stability. Now, let me be clear. Gratitude, it does matter. Responsibility, it does matter. But eventually, people have to ask themselves, am I building a meaningful life or am I only surviving a familiar one? That's a difficult conversation or question emotionally because many people become so focused on protecting comfort that they slowly stop pursuing growth altogether. And over time, fear disguises itself as wisdom. That is very dangerous, family, because eventually people stop challenging environments, limitations, labels, assumptions, and start emotionally accepting lies they eternally know no longer aligns with who they're becoming. Experiment with these actionable tips. Pay attention to the internal narratives you repeat most during difficult seasons. Next one, ask yourself honestly whether your current decisions are being driven more by growth or by fear of discomfort. Why is this important? People who never challenge limited narratives often remain emotionally stuck long after opportunities for growth can become available. Because eventually the mind can become more restrictive than the environment itself. And when fear controls perspective, growth begins feeling dangerous instead of necessary. Here's my professional advice, family. Gratitude should not become an excuse for abandoning your potential. You can appreciate where you are while you're still pursuing who you are becoming. But eventually, life has a way of teaching people lessons emotionally that warnings alone could never fully teach. Principle number 2, experience teaches lessons differently than any advice. Again, experience teaches lessons differently than advice. One of the most humbling things about life is realizing that some lessons do not fully make sense until you experience them personally, until you personally live them. And honestly, most of us are guilty of this. People warn us, advise us, they try to prepare us, but internally we think, again, you've lived that. You've done that. That won't happen to me until life puts us directly into the situation ourselves. That's why experiences change the perspective differently than information. I learned this deeply while leading projects. The team warned me about a stakeholder. I heard the warning, but I still needed to experience it personally to fully understand the emotional reality behind what they meant. And honestly, leadership works the same way. A lot of people casually judge leadership until they personally experience it, meaning accountability, the pressures, the conflicting personalities, the unrealistic expectations, and the communication breakdown. Then suddenly their perspective changes completely because experiences teaches lessons emotionally, not just intellectually. Experiment with these actionable tips. Listen carefully to people who have genuinely lived through situations you are approaching. Next one, stay humble enough to allow experience to refine your perspective instead of only defending your assumptions. Why is this important? People who refuse to learn from both advice and experience often repeat avoidable struggles longer than necessary because wisdom requires humility and eventually growth accelerates when people stop assuming they've already understood everything before living through it themselves. Here's my professional advice, family. Experience has a way of humbling opinions quicker, or I should say quickly, once pressure becomes personal. And eventually, one of the biggest traps people fall into is accepting labels, judgment without fully understanding the context behind them. Principle number 3, labels without context creates misunderstanding. One of the most frustrating things about leadership is quickly being assigned labels without fully understanding the pressure, the reasoning, and the context behind it. Like I said, they say you're defensive. They say you don't take feedback. They say, man, you are very difficult to work with. Oh, you're just too intense. You're obsessed about life and being better. But honestly, effective communication requires more than a label. It requires understanding. That's why when some people call me defensive, I don't immediately become emotional. I just ask questions. What do you specifically mean when you said that you feel I'm being defensive? How would you recommend I respond differently? What is the context maybe I'm missing here? See, those questions really expose what somebody is really saying because somebody will throw a word on you and then they don't have a context for a deeper understanding to back up the context of what they're saying. Meaning, if someone is calling you defensive and you're asking, why do you feel that I'm being defensive? And they give you some, they can't really articulate themselves well. Now you got them. And it's not about a tick for tack because you really want to know, hey, maybe I am being defensive or the perception or that you believe that I'm being defensive. Allow me to correct it because when you ask me something or you give me feedback and I tell you, hey, let me give you some context of the direction I'm thinking, I'm collaborating with you to help you understand where I'm coming from so you won't perceive that I am being defensive. Okay, I'll leave it alone, family. The realization changed how I communicate with people because now I try to seek understanding before emotionally accepting labels placed on me by others. Here's two actionable tips I'd love for you to experiment with. Ask clarifying questions before emotionally accepting criticism or labels. Next one, separate constructive feedback from emotional reactive assumption. Why is this important? People who blindly accept every negative label assigned to them often damages their confidence unnecessarily because repeated misunderstanding could slowly distort identity if people never challenge inaccurate narratives. And eventually, emotionally exhausted professionals begin questioning themselves instead of questioning the incomplete communication. Here's my professional advice, family. Healthy communication is not a blind agreement. It is a mutual understanding built through honest dialogue and context. And maybe that's the real reason. Many people are not only trapped by environments, but trapped by narratives, labels, limited beliefs. They stopped questioning long time ago. Here's the truth. Some of you are listening to me right now. You're not physically trapped. You're mentally exhausted from carrying responsibilities, expectations, pressures, narratives that no longer fully align with who or what and where you are going. And honestly, that's a difficult place to live in emotionally because part of it, again, you're grateful, but the other part of it knows that there's still more inside of you waiting to be developed. I understand that tension very deeply because I've learned that some of the biggest battles in life are not always external. Sometimes there are internal conversations around fear, identity, self-worth, comfort, growth, and belief. And eventually, every person has to make a decision. You heard me say decision, right? Because do I continue accepting those narratives, those labels, those limited beliefs that have been placed around my life? Or do I start thinking deeply enough to challenge what no longer aligns with who and what and where I am going? Because maybe the real danger is not only staying trapped physically, maybe the real danger is emotionally settling into a version of life that no longer challenges you to grow. So keep learning, keep sharpening your craft, keep questioning limitations, keep developing yourself because sometimes growth begins the moment you stop blindly accepting every belief that once kept you emotionally small. And maybe that's the real shift. The moment you stop asking whether you're trapped, and start asking whether the version of your life you're protecting still aligns with the person you're becoming. I understand it. I've lived it. And honestly, I'm still living it. But we must build anyway. If you're new to the episode, I go by the name of ED. For all you smart and intelligent folks out there, that just simply means Ed. Until next time.